You stop for a moment because something that has never bothered you before suddenly refuses to leave your mind. It is not because you want to attack anyone's beliefs. It is not because you woke up determined to reject traditions that have shaped civilizations. It is because you notice a strange feeling that appears whenever a story has been repeated so many times that almost nobody pauses to ask what it actually means. Imagine hearing the same extraordinary claim since childhood until it becomes emotionally familiar instead of intellectually surprising. Then, one ordinary day, you hear the exact same claim as if it were completely new. Suddenly you realize how astonishing it really is. A child conceived without a human father. A birth presented as both miraculous and deeply meaningful. Whether someone approaches that story with faith, doubt, or simple curiosity, it raises questions that reach far beyond biology. Why do stories like this carry such power over the human imagination? Why do miraculous births appear in so many cultures throughout history? What is it about the human mind that seems drawn toward origins that transcend ordinary experience? Perhaps the uncomfortable part is not whether the story happened exactly as described. Perhaps the uncomfortable part is recognizing how quickly familiarity can replace reflection. Most people have experienced something similar outside religion. You hear a family story repeated every holiday until nobody remembers where it came from. You repeat advice because your parents repeated it. You defend an idea before realizing you have never actually examined it for yourself. That realization can feel strangely unsettling because it forces you to separate what you genuinely believe from what simply became part of your identity. The question is not whether faith is irrational or whether skepticism is superior. The question is much more personal. How often do we inherit certainty before we inherit curiosity? That question reaches into every area of life, not only religion. It reaches into politics, relationships, traditions, and even the stories we tell about ourselves. You may have spent years believing you were incapable of change simply because someone once told you that was your personality. You may have accepted a family expectation because questioning it felt like betraying the people you loved. Human beings rarely begin by choosing their deepest assumptions. More often, we receive them long before we develop the ability to evaluate them. That does not automatically make those assumptions false. It simply means they deserve thoughtful examination. This is where conversations about extraordinary religious claims often become emotionally difficult. For many people, questioning a doctrine does not feel like evaluating an idea. It feels like threatening a relationship, a community, or a lifetime of cherished memories. Others experience the opposite reaction. They feel that refusing to ask difficult questions is itself a betrayal of honesty. Both experiences reveal something deeply human. We do not merely believe ideas, we build identities around them. Once identity becomes involved, curiosity often gives way to defense. Yet history shows that sincere believers, thoughtful skeptics, philosophers, historians, and theologians have all wrestled with difficult questions while arriving at different conclusions. That diversity itself reminds us that some questions resist simple answers. The story of the virgin birth occupies a unique place because it exists at the intersection of history, theology, symbolism, and personal faith. Some understand it literally as a miracle that points beyond ordinary natural processes. Others see layers of literary symbolism that communicate profound theological meaning regardless of historical interpretation. Still others approach it through the lens of comparative mythology, noticing that accounts of remarkable births appear in many civilizations, each expressing something about hope, destiny, or the conviction that certain lives carry extraordinary significance. None of those perspectives eliminates the others. They simply illuminate different ways human beings have searched for meaning. Perhaps what makes this discussion so emotionally charged is not the event itself, but what people fear might follow from questioning it. If one part of a cherished worldview feels uncertain, does everything else begin to unravel? That fear is understandable because certainty often provides comfort in an unpredictable world. Yet, uncertainty has its own value. It can invite humility. It can remind us that human understanding is always limited. It can encourage conversations where disagreement is not treated as hostility, but as an opportunity to think more deeply together. Many of the most important discoveries in science, philosophy, and even theology began with someone quietly asking a question that others assumed had already been answered. The question itself was not an act of rebellion. It was an act of curiosity. That distinction matters. Curiosity does not require disrespect. Reflection does not require contempt. A person can examine a sacred story with seriousness while recognizing its profound importance to millions of people across cultures and generations. In fact, the willingness to think carefully about meaningful ideas may itself be a form of respect. Whether one ultimately accepts the story as literal history, symbolic theology, or something in between, the journey of asking why it has endured for centuries reveals as much about humanity as it does about religion. Perhaps that is the deeper invitation. Instead of rushing towards certainty, pause long enough to notice your own reaction. Does the question make you uncomfortable because you fear it undermines something precious? Does it excite you because it challenges inherited assumptions? Or does it simply remind you that some of the oldest stories continue to provoke reflection precisely because they touch questions that have never stopped mattering? How do we recognize truth? What makes something believable? How should we respond when a claim lies beyond ordinary experience? Those questions remain with us regardless of where we finally land, and they may be more revealing than any immediate answer. As the first wave of certainty begins to fade, another realization quietly takes its place. Perhaps the real tension has never been between faith and reason as much as between our desire for clear answers and the reality that some of life's biggest questions refuse to fit neatly into either category. Human beings have always lived with mysteries that stretch beyond direct observation. We fall in love without fully explaining why one person changes our life while another does not. We experience beauty that cannot be measured with scientific instruments. We make sacrifices for strangers, even when there is no obvious advantage in doing so. None of those experiences eliminate the importance of evidence, but they remind us that not every meaningful part of human life is approached in exactly the same way. That is why discussions about miraculous claims often become conversations about much more than the claims themselves. They become conversations about the standards we use when evaluating different kinds of truth. Consider how differently people respond to extraordinary events depending on the context. If someone tells you they witnessed something impossible, your first instinct may be skepticism. If a trusted friend tells you about an experience that changed their life in a way they cannot explain, you may not immediately believe their interpretation, but you are more likely to listen because you recognize that lived experience carries emotional weight even when it does not settle historical questions. Religious traditions often occupy that complicated space where history, symbolism, memory, and personal transformation overlap. For some, the virgin birth functions primarily as a historical event. For others, it is inseparable from its theological significance. For still others, its enduring influence says more about humanity's search for hope than about the mechanics of biological possibility. These perspectives are not identical, and thoughtful people have defended each of them with sincerity for centuries. That alone should encourage humility rather than easy dismissal. It is tempting to imagine that every important question has only two possible positions: complete acceptance or complete rejection. Yet, real intellectual life rarely unfolds that way. Historians may examine the literary development of ancient texts without claiming to resolve questions of faith. Theologians may explore symbolic meaning without insisting that symbolism diminishes significance. Philosophers may ask what miracle language communicates about human longing, without pretending they have solved the mystery of whether miracles occur. Even among people who share the same religious tradition, there is often remarkable diversity in how sacred narratives are understood, interpreted, and lived. That diversity reflects an important truth about people in general. We do not simply process information. We interpret it through experience, relationships, culture, education, and the questions that matter most to us. Someone who has found profound comfort in a religious community may naturally approach these stories differently from someone whose journey has been shaped by historical inquiry or scientific investigation. Neither person's starting point automatically determines the quality of their thinking. What matters is whether curiosity remains possible alongside conviction. Perhaps that is the more difficult challenge. It is relatively easy to defend conclusions we already hold. It is much harder to ask ourselves what kind of evidence, experience, or reasoning would genuinely make us reconsider them. That question is uncomfortable because it turns the conversation inward. Instead of asking whether someone else's worldview is coherent, we begin examining our own habits of thought. Do we demand impossible standards from ideas we dislike, while accepting weak arguments for ideas we already prefer? Do we confuse familiarity with certainty? Do we mistake confidence for understanding? These questions extend far beyond religion. They shape the way we approach politics, science, family traditions, and even our own memories. Psychological research has repeatedly suggested that human beings are remarkably skilled at protecting existing beliefs, often without realizing it. We notice information that supports our expectations more readily than information that challenges them. We interpret ambiguous situations in ways that preserve our sense of coherence. Recognizing these tendencies does not mean every belief is equally valid. It simply reminds us that intellectual honesty requires ongoing self-examination. That is one reason conversations about sacred stories continue to matter. They become opportunities to practice listening, questioning, and thinking with care, rather than treating disagreement as a personal threat. There is also another dimension that deserves attention. Stories endure not only because people believe they happened, but because they express hopes, fears, and aspirations that remain deeply human. Across civilizations, narratives about remarkable beginnings often communicate that an individual's life carries extraordinary purpose. Whether one approaches such stories as history, theology, literature, or cultural memory, they reveal something about humanity's enduring desire to believe that goodness, meaning, and transformation can emerge in unexpected ways. Even those who ultimately reject miraculous explanations may still recognize why these narratives have inspired art, music, compassion, and reflection across generations. Likewise, those who embrace them as matters of faith may acknowledge that thoughtful questions need not be signs of disrespect. They can instead reflect the same search for understanding that has animated philosophers, historians, and religious thinkers for centuries. If there is one lesson worth carrying forward, it may be that our response to difficult questions often says as much about our character as our eventual conclusions do. Are we willing to admit uncertainty where uncertainty genuinely exists? Can we distinguish between confidence and certainty? Can we disagree without assuming bad intentions? Those questions matter regardless of what we believe about any single narrative. They shape the kind of conversations we create and the kind of people we become while seeking answers. And perhaps that is why stories that have endured for so long continue to invite reflection today. They remind us that the search for meaning is rarely a straight path towards simple conclusions. More often, it is a journey that asks us to hold conviction and humility together, recognizing both the depth of our questions and the limits of our understanding. If this journey has led anywhere, it is toward a realization that is both liberating and unsettling. The deepest questions about existence rarely end with a final argument that silences every objection. Instead, they invite each generation to examine them again with fresh eyes. Perhaps that is why stories that have survived for thousands of years continue to provoke discussion. They are not merely historical claims or theological statements. They become mirrors that reveal how different people approach uncertainty itself. Some are drawn first to evidence, asking what can reasonably be established through historical investigation. Others begin with the conviction that reality may include dimensions that cannot always be evaluated by ordinary historical methods. Neither approach automatically eliminates the other because they are often asking related but distinct questions. One asks what most likely happened, the other asks what a community has understood that event to mean. Confusing those questions can lead to conversations in which people seem to disagree while actually speaking about different subjects. This distinction appears throughout history. A work of literature may describe events that never occurred in a literal sense while communicating profound truths about courage, forgiveness, or sacrifice. Conversely, An event may be historically verifiable, yet carry very different meanings for different communities. Human beings have always lived at the intersection of fact and interpretation. We do not merely record events. We tell stories about them, assign significance to them, and weave them into our understanding of ourselves. That process is not unique to religion. Families do it. Nations do it. Individuals do it every time they look back on their own lives and decide which moments defined them. This perspective encourages another question that may be even more important than whether a particular claim appears unusual. Why do some stories become central to people's identities while others disappear almost immediately? The answer cannot simply be repetition. Countless stories have been repeated and forgotten. Enduring narratives often survive because they speak to enduring human concerns, hope in the face of despair, the possibility that ordinary lives can have extraordinary purpose, the belief that history is not merely a sequence of accidents but can possess meaning. Whether someone embraces those themes through religious faith, philosophical reflection, or secular humanism, they remain powerful because they address experiences shared across cultures and centuries. That observation also reminds us to be careful with certainty. History is filled with examples of people who believed they possessed complete understanding, only to discover later that reality was more complex than they imagined. Scientific knowledge has grown through revising earlier conclusions. Historical scholarship continually uncovers new evidence and proposes new interpretations. Religious traditions themselves have developed rich histories of debate, commentary, and reinterpretation. None of this means that truth is impossible to pursue. It means that the pursuit of truth often requires patience, humility, and a willingness to distinguish confidence from absolute certainty. Perhaps the greatest danger is not asking difficult questions, but believing that difficult questions can always be resolved quickly. Some remain open because they touch realities larger than any individual perspective. Others remain open because the available evidence allows for multiple reasonable interpretations. Learning to live with that tension may be one of the most mature intellectual and emotional achievements available to us. It does not require abandoning conviction. It requires recognizing that conviction becomes stronger, not weaker, when it has faced honest examination. In that sense, thoughtful dialogue between believers, skeptics, historians, philosophers, and curious observers is not a sign that humanity has failed to find answers. It is evidence that humanity continues to care about questions that shape how we understand life, purpose, and ourselves. Whether one ultimately accepts the virgin birth as a historical miracle, understands it primarily through theological symbolism, or remains unconvinced by either interpretation, the discussion has value when it deepens empathy, curiosity, and intellectual integrity rather than division. Perhaps the most meaningful outcome is not reaching identical conclusions, but becoming the kind of people who can explore profound disagreements without losing respect for one another. That may be the lesson hidden beneath many of humanity's oldest conversations. Our search for truth is inseparable from our willingness to listen, to question honestly, and to recognize that every person approaches the unknown carrying a unique combination of experience, hope, doubt, and conviction. In the end, the conversation is not simply about one ancient story. It is about how we respond whenever we encounter an idea that stretches the limits of our understanding. Do we dismiss it immediately because it challenges our expectations? Do we accept it uncritically because it comforts us? Or do we allow it to become an invitation to think more deeply about the remarkable complexity of belief, reason, history, and the enduring human search for meaning? Those questions remain open, and perhaps their enduring power lies precisely in the fact that each generation must wrestle with them anew, bringing its own knowledge, its own doubts, and its own hopes to a conversation that is unlikely ever to be finished.